The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Member Giles Chevelle.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I was reading an article from The Independent that was published on Monday. And I know Mr Bennett doesn't like to read, but it is actually quite a useful thing to do from time to time if we want to know what's happening in the world. If he wants to follow the lead of the previous speaker and lay some sort of claim on behalf of his party to be doing something about this issue in a credible way, he might like to do some reading as well at some point. The Independent tells us this: the world is destined for dangerous climate change this century, with global temperatures possibly rising by as much as 6% because of the failure of governments to find alternatives to fossil fuels. And this is all contained in a recent report, not from some group that this government might like to try to malign as interested or fringe, but from a pretty mainstream consultancy, the accountancy giant PricewaterhouseCoopers. And what PwC conclude is this: it will now be almost impossible to keep the increase in global average temperatures up to 2100 within the 2 centigrade target that scientists believe might avert dangerous and unpredictable climate change. And an analysis of how fast the major world economies are reducing their emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel use suggests that it may already be too late to stay within the 2% target that was set by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was a key finding of the PricewaterhouseCoopers study. In order to try to get within that target, the global economy would have to reach what it described as a decarbonisation rate of at least 5% a year for the next 40 years. And obviously, we haven't seen anything like that happen since records began to be kept at the end of the Second World War. Even if we doubled the current rate with which we are dealing with this concept of decarbonisation, there'd still be emissions consistent with about 6 degrees centigrade of warming by the end of the century. To give ourselves a more than 50% chance of avoiding 2 degrees centigrade will require a 6-fold improvement in our rate of decarbonisation. So we might as well just start planning for a warmer world. That's the conclusion from PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's too late. And they say this: it's not shock tactics, it's simple maths. We're heading into uncharted territory for the scale of transformation and technological innovations required. Whatever the scenario or response, business as usual is not an option. And what's the response from the New Zealand government to this phenomenon? Well, we just heard it. We don't want to be leaders in this area. If only that were just the simple truth. They don't want to do anything of practical effect in this area. And not only do they not want to do anything of practical effect, they want to hide and obscure the effect of what is being done. And I was astounded when I began to read the Select Committee papers surrounding this bill, sir, to see the extent to which ministers and officials, under the instruction of those ministers, have been seeking to obscure the truth of what is going on now. What I'm sad we didn't hear from the current minister, but I'm hoping we might hear some enlightenment from Dr Smith or other speakers, is this: why is the government seeking, for example, to exclude ETS units from being valued in the Crown's financial statements? I mean, the translation of that, sir, is that ministers are asking whether local carbon credits given away by the government as corporate welfare and compensation should even be shown as a cost to the taxpayer. Whether the taxpayer who's paying for these sort of things should even be allowed to know, A, that they're doing it, and B, what it's costing them. So this government has systematically suppressed detail on the cost of the emissions trading scheme. It absolutely has, Dr Smith, so that this very complex scheme is harder still to monitor. It is absolutely breathtaking in my view, sir, that a minister would ask officials to consider not valuing something that, when given away, means the recipient has to pay no tax. Such gifts must be recorded as costs to the taxpayer. This is in line with simple, generally agreed accounting practice. It's in line with the sort of openness and accountability that we expect from governments and that actually the law requires, because we have a Public Finance Act in this country and we do require transparency from government. And if we do allow this sort of obscurity to take hold, then sir, it will be, as was predicted, longer than the 2-year time frame that the Minister seems to know about. This debate's been going on for a lot longer than that. As was predicted at the time that the government originally introduced its so-called moderation of the scheme, this is a recipe for corruption. Because if the public cannot know what the value of subsidies it is paying through the now perverted and ineffective emissions trading scheme that we will see emerging out the other side of this legislation, then we have a major problem with transparency in this country. And the chairperson of the Finance and Expenditure Committee will no doubt speak later in the debate. I hope he takes a close interest in this issue, because we'll all be looking to him to ensure that this doesn't happen. And yet we've got a minister, we know, in the chair on this issue who wants to obscure the facts and who wants to make it far more difficult for us to know what the cost of this subsidy is, sir. On the question of transparency, I think the most disappointing thing for me out of the debate over the last week or so in the House was this: the voting down of one of the supplementary order papers put up by my colleague Moana Maki. Now, I said, I think in an earlier contribution, that one of the things I was heartened about in earlier parts of this debate years ago was Dr. Smith's professed commitment to transparency, but this commitment seems to have absolutely vanished, because National voted against this supplementary order paper, sir, and all it would have done was require the Environmental Protection Authority to publish annually the amount that industries charge their customers for carbon. That's all. It would have allowed the public to see through some of the opacity that this government has now introduced around what is just, thanks to the changes it's made, a massive transfer of wealth from taxpayers to polluters. But the public isn't going to get that chance, because National and its allies, Mr Banks and Mr Dunn, voted this amendment down. Now, there's no evidence, sir, that the benefits of either the low carbon price that the Minister mentioned, or if the government's so-called moderation of the scheme are being passed on to consumers. They're being kept as profits by these polluters, sir. I was astounded in question time in the last session of Parliament when Simon Bridges, as the acting minister, was questioned in the House on what evidence he had that prices were being brought down by government policy in this area. The only answer he could come up with was his constituents told him so. Sir, evidence to the Select Committee that all the members who sat on that committee know about showed that through fuel and electricity prices, consumers are still being charged a carbon price of between $15 and $25. Absolutely. That is absolutely the evidence. And we all know that the actual carbon price is about $1. So where are those profits going? And why is if I'm wrong, Dr. Smith, why is the government so scared to be transparent, to introduce a requirement that the EPA have transparency around whether or not there is any pass-on of a reduction, or whether these profits are being retained by the corporates? Contact Energy, I'll give you an example, has yet to review its levies introduced in 2010, which add to consumers' power bills 0.77 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity and 0.27 cents for gas. It even wrote in its 2012 annual report that additional savings from carbon unit costs helped cause its improved profits in the last year. This is what the emissions trading scheme has become under this government, sir, an unjustifiable mess that cannot be penetrated as far as those who wish to see what is really going on here. It is simply corporate welfare and an opportunity for corruption, and we must be very, very worried about it, sir. We must be very worried indeed. And the tragedy of this bill, which we're now reading a third time, is it will do nothing to make a bad situation worse, and everything to make the situation far worse than it is.
I call the honourable member